Hey dreamers, tonight we're stepping into one of mythology's most unexpected origin stories. Not a fall from greatness, but a fall that becomes the very spark of destiny. Imagine the golden halls of Olympus, where gods dine on ambrosia and shape the world with effortless ease. In that radiant place there lies a tale of exclusion that doesn't break a god, but transforms him. This is the story of Hephaestus, the master of fire and craft, and how a single moment of rejection became the forge that shaped his genius. And here's where the fascination begins. How does a cast-out child of Olympus rise to become the creator of weapons, wonders, and living marvels? What inner fire drives someone to build beauty from the very thing that wounded them? And why does the quietest god often leave behind the most extraordinary creations? Before we settle in, tap like if these stories help you unwind, and hit subscribe so you never miss a new mythic journey. And tell me in the comments, which god or creator figure has always fascinated you the most? Now, let's begin at the very beginning, with a birth that should have been joyous, but instead carried the seeds of celestial dysfunction. In the beginning, there was only Hera and Zeus, the king and queen of Olympus, bound in marriage that was as passionate as it was combustible, had already produced many divine children, Ares, Enyo, and Eris among them. But Hera harbored a secret ambition, one that spoke to something deeper in the divine heart. She wanted to bear a child entirely through her own power, without the need for Zeus's contribution. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was a desire to prove her sovereignty. Perhaps it was simply a Tuesday on Olympus, where apparently the definition of reasonable divine projects was considerably more unhinged than one might expect. So Hera conceived, and she carried that child alone, a feat that sent ripples through the cosmos. She was creating life from pure divinity, channeling the raw power of her own essence into a single, precious being. The act itself was extraordinary, a demonstration of the profound creative force that lay within the Queen of the Gods. And in her mind, this child would be a monument to her independence, a living proof that she needed no one else to create something beautiful. But when the child was born, something went terribly wrong. The infant that emerged from Hera's divine labor was not beautiful in the way the gods expected beauty to manifest. Hephaestus was born with a twisted foot, a deformity that marked him immediately as different from his perfect, radiant siblings. In a realm where physical perfection was synonymous with power and favor, this single imperfection became a kind of cosmic tragedy. The baby was not wrong, you understand, but he was wrong by the standards of a divine family obsessed with flawlessness. Hera looked at her son, this child she had created alone, with her own power, and something inside her shattered. The pride that had driven her to conceive him now transformed into shame. The mother who was meant to love unconditionally, who had performed this extraordinary act of solo creation, now looked at her newborn with something that resembled horror. How could she have made something imperfect? How could her divine power have resulted in something so visibly, unmistakably flawed? And so began one of mythology's most heartbreaking rejections. What's particularly fascinating about Hera as a character is that she never quite does anything halfway. Whether it's love, loyalty, or rage, she commits fully. In this case, her commitment was to rejection so complete that it became almost legendary in its thoroughness. Have you ever wondered what it must feel like to be rejected by your own parent in such a visceral, immediate way? For me, it has to be one of the most isolating experiences one could imagine. That moment when you realize that your existence itself is a disappointment. Hephaestus would carry that wound forever. The ancient sources tell us different versions of what happened next, each one a variation on the theme of abandonment. In one telling, Hera was so appalled by her son's deformity that she instantly hurled him from the heights of Olympus itself. In another, she kept him hidden away, ashamed to let the other gods witness her imperfect creation. But the end result was always the same. Hephaestus was cast out. He was unwanted. He was alone. The fall from Olympus itself was less a journey and more a descent into cosmic exile. Imagine, if you will, the sensation of being thrown from the highest place in existence, not by an enemy, but by your mother. The sky that should have been home became hostile. The air itself seemed to turn cold and rejecting. Hephaestus tumbled through the heavens, his small divine form spinning through the void, watching the gleaming halls of his birthplace recede behind him. The destination of this catastrophic fall varied depending on which version of the myth you consulted, as if the ancients themselves were unsure of where such a broken god could possibly land. Some sources say he fell for an entire day, his descent so prolonged that it became almost its own kind of punishment. Others suggest he landed in the ocean, where the Nereid nymphs, the sea goddesses, found him and took him in. In some versions, it was Thetis herself, the famous mother of Achilles, who rescued him and nursed him back to wholeness. Can you imagine it? A baby god, broken in body and spirit, discovered floating in the sea by creatures who had no obligation to help him, yet chose compassion anyway. The irony is almost too heavy to bear, that a god cast out by his divine mother would find shelter with lesser beings, with creatures whom the gods often treated with casual indifference. What's remarkable about Hephaestus's rescue is that it offered him something Hera never could, acceptance without condition. The sea nymphs did not look at his twisted foot and see failure. They saw a child who needed care, who needed safety, who needed love. For the first time in his existence, Hephaestus knew what it felt like to be wanted, however temporarily. But temporary is precisely what it was. The sea was not his home. The nymphs, for all their kindness, could not replace what had been torn from him at birth, the chance to belong to his family, to stand among the gods as an equal. He would emerge from those protective waters, changed, hardened by rejection and loss, but also forged by something else entirely, the beginning of understanding. And this is where the real transformation begins, you see. Hephaestus's fall was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of his true nature. Cast out from heaven, rejected by the one being who should have loved him unconditionally, he began to understand something that would define the rest of his eternal existence. If the world would not accept him as he was, then he would remake the world. If his body was broken, then his mind would become unbreakable. If his mother had cast him aside, then he would become so invaluable, so essential, that eventually even those who rejected him would need him desperately. The pain of that fall, the sting of that rejection, did not destroy Hephaestus. Instead, it became the forge in which his greatest gifts were tempered. Have you ever experienced a moment where something painful actually pushed you toward becoming something greater? For me, it has to be those moments when rejection clarifies your purpose. Hephaestus would carry his pain forward like a divine burden, and it would fuel every hammer strike, every creative impulse, every moment of genius that would define his legacy. Because here's what makes this mythology so profound, and why it continues to resonate through the centuries. Hephaestus's fall from Olympus wasn't just a moment of divine family drama. It was the beginning of a god who understood suffering in a way that other immortals never could. He knew what it felt like to be unwanted. He knew what it felt like to be abandoned. And instead of letting that knowledge destroy him, he would transform it into something extraordinary, into purpose, into mastery, into a kind of divine resilience that would make him indispensable. The fall that Hera meant as a punishment became the greatest gift Hephaestus could have ever received, though he would never have asked for it. And that, perhaps more than anything else, speaks to the cruel irony that runs through all of mythology, that sometimes our deepest wounds become the source of our greatest strength. The halls of Olympus stretched on above him as he fell, growing smaller and more distant with each passing moment. The divine light that had been his birthright faded as he descended further into the mortal realm. And yet, somewhere in that falling, somewhere in that loss, the seeds of something remarkable were already beginning to grow, seeds that would eventually produce not just a god, but a creator, an innovator, a being whose gifts would outlast kingdoms and whose story would echo through human consciousness for thousands of years to come. In that moment of abandonment, Hephaestus was becoming himself. The fall from Olympus was not his ending, it was his beginning. The fire that burned within him, the divine flame that would later fuel his forge and power his creative genius. That fire was being lit now in the darkness of his descent. And when he finally came to rest, when his journey from the sky to the earth was complete, he would rise again, transformed by pain into something that Hera, in her limited divine understanding, could never have anticipated or controlled. But that is a story for another moment. For now, we leave Hephaestus in the waters of the sea, held by the compassionate hands of the Nereids, cradled by the very ocean that accepted what heaven rejected. And in that acceptance, in that small mercy offered by lesser beings to a fallen god, the true nature of his destiny begins to take shape. A destiny written not in the halls of Olympus, but in the forge of experience, suffering, resilience, and the unshakable determination to create beauty and meaning from the ashes of rejection. The sea that received Hephaestus was not cold, though by all rights it should have been. Not to a divine body, perhaps, but to a divine heart that had just experienced the cruelest possible introduction to existence. And yet, as the waves closed over the small, broken form of the infant god, something extraordinary happened. The ocean, which so often in myth serves as a barrier, a trial, a place of monsters and drowning, became instead a refuge. Because waiting there, in the depths where light fractured into blues and greens and shadows, were two beings who would change everything, Thetis and Eurynomy, sea goddesses who possessed something that Hera, for all her divine power, seemed to lack entirely, the simple, revolutionary capacity for compassion. Have you ever considered what it means to be saved by strangers? For me, it has to be one of the most profound experiences imaginable. That moment when someone with no obligation, no connection, no reason to care, chooses to care anyway. Thetis and Eurynomy looked at this fallen god-child, this divine cast-off with his twisted foot and his mother's rejection still clinging to him like a curse, and they made a choice that would echo through eternity. They took him in. They raised him. And in doing so, they gave him something infinitely more valuable than shelter. They gave him the possibility of becoming himself. Furs. The ancient sources tell us that Hephaestus dwelt with these sea goddesses for 9 years in a grotto, surrounded by the endless movement of Oceanus itself, hidden away from the world that had cast him out. Picture it, if you will, a cave beneath the waves, where the light filters down in shimmering curtains, and the sound of water is the only constant. This was Hephaestus's first real home, not the gleaming halls of Olympus where he was born and rejected in the same breath, but this quiet, submerged sanctuary where he was, for the first time in his existence, wanted. What must it have been like for him those early years? The sources don't dwell on the details of his childhood, as if the ancients themselves couldn't quite imagine what it meant for a god to grow up in exile, but we can extrapolate from what we know. Here was a child who carried physical pain in his very body, whose deformity marked him as different from the perfect, radiant beings who populated the divine realm. And yet here, in the depths, that difference didn't matter. Thetis and Eurynomy didn't see failure when they looked at him, they saw potential. And so they taught him, they nurtured him, they gave him the space to discover what his hands could do. The mythology tells us that Hephaestus began, in those underwater years, to create things. At first, simple objects, ornaments made from the materials at hand, seashells, coral, the detritus of the ocean floor transformed into beauty. It's almost heartbreakingly humble, isn't it? The god who would one day forge thunderbolts and divine armor, starting with seaside souvenirs, with trinkets made from what the sea offered up. But there's something profound in that humility, something that speaks to the nature of all craft and creation. You begin where you are, with what you have, and you learn by doing. And what Hephaestus learned in those quiet years beneath the waves was that his hands, the hands attached to a body his mother had deemed unworthy, were capable of miracles. The underwater forge that would become legendary, that would eventually produce some of the most powerful artifacts in all of mythology, didn't spring into being fully formed. It grew organically, naturally, as Hephaestus's talent grew. The sea nymphs watched as the child they had rescued began to experiment with divine fire, the kind that could burn even underwater, that responded to will and intent rather than mere physical law. They watched as he learned to shape metal, to understand the properties of bronze and iron and gold, to see in raw materials the finished forms they could become. This is where the true genius of Hephaestus begins to manifest, you see, not in some sudden revelation or divine gift bestowed from above, but in the patient, methodical accumulation of skill. Hour after hour, day after day, year after year, he worked. He failed. He tried again. He learned what heat did to different metals, how alloys changed properties, what shapes held strength, and which ones would shatter under pressure. The forge became his language, the one place where his imperfect body didn't matter, where the only thing that counted was the quality of what his hands could produce. And the quality, it turned out, was extraordinary. Imagine the moment when Thetis first realized that the child she had rescued from the sea wasn't just talented, he was transformatively, revolutionarily gifted. Perhaps it was when he presented her with something he had made, some ornament or tool that showed not just skill, but genuine artistry, the kind of work that made you stop and stare and wonder how such a thing could exist. Perhaps it was when she saw him working at his forge, his concentration so complete that the pain in his twisted foot seemed to disappear, his entire being focused on the transformation of raw material into finished beauty. Whatever the moment, she must have understood then that Hephaestus's fall from Olympus, as cruel as it had also been, in the strangest, most painful way possible, a kind of liberation. Because here, away from the judgment and the standards and the expectations of the divine realm, Hephaestus was free to become something the gods of Olympus rarely managed, truly himself. The forge he built beneath the waves was unlike anything the world had seen, a place where divine fire met ocean depth, where the elements themselves seemed to bend to his will. He learned to work with bellows that drove air even in the underwater environment, to create temperatures that could melt the hardest metals, to quench finished pieces in seawater that added its own unique properties to the work. The technical challenges alone would have defeated most craftsmen, divine or otherwise. But Hephaestus didn't just overcome them. He turned them into advantages, finding ways to use the unique properties of his underwater environment to create effects that no surface forge could match. Have you ever found that your greatest limitations became, through necessity and creativity, your greatest strengths? For me, it has to be one of the most transformative realizations possible, that what you thought was holding you back was actually pushing you toward innovation. Hephaestus embodied this principle entirely. The 9 years he spent with Thetis and Eurynome were formative in ways that went far beyond mere technical skill. Yes, he was learning to be a craftsman, learning the secrets of metallurgy and design and creation. But he was also learning something deeper, something that would define his character for the rest of his eternal existence. He was learning that value doesn't come from the perfection of your form or the circumstances of your birth. It comes from what you can do, from what you can create, from the work of your hands and the vision of your mind. Total, the gods of Olympus, with their beauty and their power and their casual cruelty, had rejected him based on appearance. But here, in the depths, surrounded by the patient instruction of sea goddesses who saw potential where others saw only flaw, Hephaestus discovered that there was another way to measure worth. Not by how you looked, but by what you could make. Not by the favor of others, but by the mastery of your craft. And oh, what mastery he achieved. The objects that began to emerge from his underwater forge were not just skillfully made, they were imbued with something that transcended mere craftsmanship. Each piece carried a spark of divine essence, a quality that made them more than the sum of their materials. A simple brooch became a thing of startling beauty. A piece of armor became not just protective but actively powerful, carrying enchantments woven into the very metal itself. Weapons forged by his hand were sharper, stronger, more perfectly balanced than any weapon had a right to be. Thetis, who would later become famous as the mother of Achilles, understood what she had. Not just a rescued godling, but a master craftsman in the making, someone whose gifts would eventually become essential to the functioning of the divine realm itself. She and Eurynomé made for him an environment where his talent could flourish without the toxic pressure of Olympic expectation, where failure was a teacher rather than a condemnation, where experimentation was encouraged rather than mocked. The underwater forge became a laboratory of divine innovation. Hephaestus experimented with alloys that no one had tried before, discovering combinations of metals that produced properties beyond what any single element could achieve. He learned to work with gold and silver, with bronze and iron, with rare metals pulled from the deepest parts of the ocean. He developed techniques for tempering and annealing, for creating patterns in metal, for inlaying precious materials into base ones to create effects that seemed almost magical. Though, of course, in his hands there was always a bit of actual magic involved as well. But perhaps more importantly than any specific technique or material, Hephaestus learned in those years the fundamental truth that would define his entire existence: that creation is its own reward. The act of taking raw materials and transforming them into something beautiful, functional, or powerful, that act itself was what mattered, not the approval or recognition of others. The satisfaction came from the work, from the moment when a piece emerged from the forge exactly as he had envisioned it, from the problem-solving and the iteration and the constant pushing at the boundaries of what was possible. This is what made him dangerous to the established order of Olympus, though they didn't realize it yet, because Hephaestus was learning that he didn't need them. He didn't need their approval, their acceptance, their validation. He had found something more reliable, more sustaining, the absolute satisfaction of mastery, of craft, of creation. The forge itself evolved as he grew in skill and understanding. What had started as a simple workspace became a complex operation, with different sections for different types of work, specialized tools for specialized tasks, and storage for materials and finished pieces. He learned to work not just with heat and hammer, but with patience and precision, understanding that some pieces required months of careful labor, that rushing would only ruin the work. The methodical nature of metalwork suited his temperament. Here was a realm where systematic thinking and careful planning produced results, where you couldn't charm or bluff your way through, where the metal itself would tell you immediately if you'd made a mistake. Have you ever found a kind of work that feels like it was made for you, where the challenges fit your particular way of thinking so perfectly that solving them feels less like labor and more like a form of conversation? For me, it has to be one of the most fulfilling experiences possible, that sense that you found your place, your purpose, the thing your hands and mind were meant to do. Hephaestus had found exactly that. And as his skill grew, so did his ambition. He began to push beyond simple ornaments and tools, began to experiment with more complex creations. Automatons, mechanical beings that could move and act with a semblance of life, emerged from his forge, early prototypes of what would later become his most famous creations. Armor that seemed to fit any wearer perfectly, that molded itself to the body it protected. Weapons that never dulled, never broke, never failed. Each piece taught him something new, pushed his understanding further, revealed new possibilities. The sea goddesses who had raised him must have watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and perhaps some sadness, knowing that eventually, inevitably, the world beyond their grotto would call him back. Because you can't hide genius forever, You can't keep that kind of talent confined to the depths. Word travels, even in the divine realm, especially when someone is creating objects of power and beauty that surpass anything seen before. But for those 9 years, Hephaestus had something that many gods never experienced: a genuine home, a place of safety and growth, and the freedom to discover who he truly was without the distorting lens of Olympic politics and prejudice. The underwater forge wasn't just a workplace. It was a sanctuary, a school, a proving ground, where a rejected godling became a master craftsman, where pain transformed into purpose, where the very qualities that had caused his rejection became the foundation of his greatest strengths. The irony, of course, and mythology loves its ironies, is that the rejection by Hera, the fall from Olympus that was meant as punishment or disposal, actually created the conditions necessary for Hephaestus to develop his extraordinary gifts. If he had remained in the halls of the gods, coddled or pitied or tolerated, he might never have discovered the fierce independence and relentless work ethic that defined him. If he had grown up surrounded by perfect, beautiful beings, he might have spent his existence trying to match them in appearance rather than surpassing them in ability. Instead, the sea gave him what Olympus never could: the space to become himself on his own terms. And what he became, there in the depths with his forge and his fire and his patient teachers, was something unprecedented. A god whose divinity lay not in his appearance or his lineage, but in the work of his hands, in his capacity to take raw elements and transform them into marvels. He became living proof that true power comes not from physical perfection or inherited status, but from skill, dedication, and the stubborn refusal to let rejection define your worth. The fire of his forge burned continuously in those years, its light filtering up through the water in strange, flickering patterns that marked the location of his workshop. Sea creatures grew accustomed to the glow, to the rhythmic sound of hammer on anvil, to the presence of this unusual resident in the ocean's depths. Thetis and Eurynome provided materials, encouragement, and the crucial gift of time to experiment, to fail, to learn, to grow without the pressure of immediate expectation or judgment. And Hephaestus used that time extraordinarily well. By the end of those 9 years, he was no longer the broken infant who had fallen from the sky. He was a master craftsman, a divine smith whose work was beginning to rival, and in some cases surpass, anything the gods of Olympus possessed. He had transformed his rejection into expertise, his pain into purpose, his isolation into concentrated mastery. The forge itself had become an extension of his will, a place where thought and creation merged seamlessly, where the gap between vision and reality narrowed to nothing. When he saw a piece in his mind's eye, his hands knew how to bring it into being. When he encountered a technical challenge, his years of patient experimentation had given him a toolkit of solutions to draw from. The methodical nature of his work meant that each piece built on the knowledge of all that came before, creating an ever-expanding foundation of skill and understanding. But there was something else growing in those depths as well, something darker and more complex than simple craftsmanship. Because Hephaestus had not forgotten his rejection. He had not forgotten the moment when his mother looked at him with horror and disgust, when she chose to throw him away rather than accept his imperfection. That wound, as much as his twisted foot, was permanent, and while he channeled his pain into creation, while he found purpose and meaning in his work, there remained a part of him that wanted something more than mastery. He wanted recognition. He wanted vindication. And perhaps, in the deepest part of his divine heart, he wanted revenge. The seeds of what would come later. The golden throne. The trap that would force Olympus to acknowledge him. The complex web of pride and hurt and determination that would define his relationship with the divine realm. Those seeds were planted here, in the underwater forge, as his skill grew and his confidence built. Because Hephaestus was learning that he had power, real power, the kind that came from being able to create things that others needed, wanted, couldn't reproduce. If the gods of Olympus had rejected him based on appearance, then he would become so valuable through his abilities that they would have no choice but to accept him. If his mother had cast him away for being imperfect, then he would create perfection with his own hands, would demonstrate that true worth had nothing to do with the accident of one's birth, and everything to do with the deliberate cultivation of one's gifts. The underwater years were ending, though Hephaestus didn't know it yet. The time was approaching when the divine realm would come calling, when his reputation would spread beyond the ocean depths, when the gods themselves would realize what they had lost and seek to reclaim it. But for now, in these final days of his underwater sanctuary, he worked on, the glow of his forge illuminating the deep waters, the sound of his hammer echoing through the grotto where two compassionate goddesses had given a rejected godchild the most precious gift imaginable, the chance to become himself. And what he had become, there in the depths with fire and metal and patience, was something that would change the divine world forever. A god who proved that power comes in many forms, that rejection can be transformed into strength, and that the truest measure of divinity lies not in how you're born, but in what you choose to create with the life you're given. The smith of the depths had found his calling. Now it was time for the world to discover what that meant. The gift arrived without warning, as the most dangerous gifts often do. It was a throne, a golden throne of such surpassing beauty that it seemed to capture and amplify the light of Olympus itself, making the halls of the gods shine even more brilliantly than usual. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, flawless in every detail, with scrollwork so delicate it seemed to breathe and precious stones set with such precision that they appeared to float within the metal rather than rest upon it. It was, by any measure, a masterpiece, the kind of object that announces its creator as someone of exceptional, perhaps unprecedented skill. And it came with a message, simple and direct, a gift for the Queen of Olympus from her son. Imagine the moment when that throne materialized in the divine halls, when word spread among the gods that Hephaestus, the rejected son, the castaway, the god who had fallen from these very heights as an unwanted infant, had sent his mother a present. The reaction must have been complex, layered with surprise and curiosity, and perhaps, among some of the more perceptive deities, a faint tremor of unease. Because gifts in mythology, especially gifts from those who have been wronged, are rarely what they appear to be. But Hera, when she saw the throne, saw only its beauty. Have you ever wanted something so badly that you ignored the warning signs, the subtle suggestions that perhaps this thing you desire carries hidden costs? For me, it has to be one of the most human of failings, and apparently one of the most divine as well. Hera looked at that golden throne and saw vindication, saw proof that her son, despite his rejection, still honored her, still sought her approval, still recognized her as his queen and mother. Or perhaps she saw it as a peace offering, an attempt at reconciliation from a son who had finally accepted his place in the cosmic order. Perhaps she thought he was acknowledging that she had been right to cast him out, that his years away had taught him proper deference and humility. Whatever her reasoning, whatever story she told herself about what this throne meant, she couldn't resist it. The throne was simply too magnificent to ignore, too perfectly crafted to refuse. So Hera sat down, and the trap closed. The ancient sources vary slightly in their description of exactly what happened. Some say the throne rose into the air, carrying Hera high above Olympus, where no god could reach her. Others describe invisible chains or fetters that sprang into being the moment she made contact with the seat, binding her so completely that she couldn't move, couldn't rise, couldn't escape. But the essential truth was the same in every telling. Hera was trapped, held fast by a creation of such subtle ingenuity that even the combined power of all the Olympian gods couldn't break it. Because this was Hephaestus's work, you see, and Hephaestus, as the divine realm was about to learn, created things that functioned exactly as he intended them to, with no exceptions and no loopholes. The Queen of Olympus, the proud goddess who had cast out her own child for the crime of being imperfect, was now imprisoned by that same child's perfect craftsmanship. The irony was so sharp you could cut yourself on it. What followed must have been remarkable to witness. The spectacle of gods, those supposedly all-powerful beings who shape the fates of mortals and worlds, confronting something they couldn't control or overcome through their usual methods. They tried, of course. The sources tell us that numerous deities attempted to free Hera from the throne using strength and magic and divine authority, but nothing worked. The throne held her as surely as if she had been rooted to the spot, its mechanisms so cunningly designed that even divine perception couldn't detect how to unlock them. This is where Hephaestus demonstrated something that would define his entire existence among the gods. That true power comes not from physical perfection or inherited authority, but from knowledge, skill, and the ability to create things that others need but cannot replicate. He had made himself indispensable by making something undoable, and he knew it. The gods sent messengers to Hephaestus, demanding that he return to Olympus and release his mother. His response, preserved in the ancient texts, was devastatingly simple: "I have no mother." 4 words that contained the weight of years of rejection, of pain transformed into purpose, of a wound that had never healed despite all the skill and mastery he had acquired. 4 words that told the gods of Olympus that this wasn't going to be resolved through commands or threats or appeals to filial duty. Because how do you appeal to familial obligation when you yourself violated that obligation at the very moment of birth? Hera, trapped on her golden throne, must have finally understood what she had created when she threw her infant son from Olympus. Not a victim who would quietly accept his fate, not a supplicant who would forever seek her approval, but someone who remembered, and who had spent years, decades perhaps, planning this exact moment. The gods tried sending Ares, the god of war, to bring Hephaestus back by force. It's almost comical, the idea that physical intimidation would work on someone who had survived rejection, exile, and the complete rebuilding of his identity from nothing. Ares came with fire and threats, with all the bluster and aggression that characterized the god of war, and Hephaestus simply refused to engage. What was Ares going to do exactly? Kill him? Cast him out? He'd already survived worse than anything Ares could inflict. A mission failed spectacularly. And so the gods of Olympus, those supremely powerful beings who rarely encountered problems they couldn't solve through force or authority, found themselves in an unfamiliar position. They needed to negotiate. They needed something from Hephaestus, and he was the only one who could provide it. The power dynamic had shifted in a way that must have been profoundly uncomfortable for deities accustomed to absolute control. Enter Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, and, crucially, the ability to see through pretense and reach the hidden truth of things. Where Ares had failed through force, Dionysus succeeded through understanding. He didn't come to Hephaestus with threats or demands. Instead, he came with wine. The sources tell us that Dionysus got Hephaestus drunk, but I think there's more to it than simple intoxication. Dionysus had a gift for creating the kind of atmosphere where truth emerged, where defenses lowered, where the complicated knots of resentment and pain could begin to untangle. He understood that Hephaestus didn't need to be defeated or forced. He needed to be heard. Have you ever held on to anger for so long that it becomes part of your identity, and then found that once someone truly acknowledged your pain, the need for revenge began to fade? For me, it has to be one of the most profound transformations possible, that moment when validation allows you to finally let go. Dionysus, in many tellings, was the one god Hephaestus trusted completely. Perhaps because Dionysus himself was an outsider among the Olympians, twice born and forever liminal. Perhaps because wine has a way of revealing what lies beneath our carefully constructed facades, Whatever the reason, Dionysus succeeded where all others had failed. He convinced Hephaestus to return to Olympus. But not without conditions. The journey back to Olympus must have been extraordinary. Hephaestus, riding on a mule, led by Dionysus, returning to the realm that had cast him out, not as a supplicant, but as someone whose presence was desperately needed. The symbolism is almost too perfect. The rejected god returning on the most humble of beasts, demonstrating that true worth has nothing to do with external grandeur and everything to do with what you can do that others cannot. The ancient sources differ on what exactly Hephaestus demanded in exchange for freeing Hera. Some say he asked for and received a permanent place among the Olympians, recognition as one of the 12 great gods despite his deformity and his history. Others tell us that Zeus, desperate to free his wife, promised Hephaestus anything he wanted, and what he wanted was Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, as his bride. The request, if that's what it was, reveals something fascinating and heartbreaking about Hephaestus. He wanted what had been denied him from birth, acceptance, belonging, and perhaps most poignantly, love from the most beautiful being in existence. If his mother had rejected him for being physically imperfect, then he would marry perfect beauty itself, would prove that his worth could compensate for any perceived physical flaw. It's a transaction that speaks to his fundamental wound. This belief that he needed to earn what should have been freely given, that his place in the world had to be purchased through achievement rather than acknowledged as a birthright. But whatever the specific terms, the essential bargain was clear. Hephaestus would release Hera and take his place among the Olympian gods as their master craftsman, their divine smith, the one whose skills were unmatched and irreplaceable. He would be essential, valued not for his appearance or his lineage, but for what his hands could create. Sinai. The moment of release must have been tense beyond measure. Hephaestus approached the throne, this object he had crafted with such care and such calculation, and did whatever was necessary to free his mother. The sources don't dwell on the mechanics, perhaps because the point wasn't the how, but the what it meant. Hera rose from the throne, freed from her golden prison, and faced the son she had rejected. What passed between them in that moment is lost to history. The myths don't record whether there was reconciliation or merely cold acknowledgement, whether Hera apologized or simply moved on as if her imprisonment had been an inconvenient accident rather than a calculated revenge. What we do know is that from that moment forward, Hephaestus was part of the Olympian pantheon. Not as a guest or a temporary resident or someone tolerated out of necessity, but as one of the 12 great gods, with his own domain, his own worshippers, and a role that made him absolutely essential to the functioning of the divine realm. He became the smith of the gods, the creator of their most powerful artifacts and weapons. It was Hephaestus who would forge Zeus's thunderbolts, those weapons that represented the king of gods' ultimate authority. It was Hephaestus who would craft Achilles' armor, making it so magnificent and so powerful that it would become legendary even among legendary objects. It was Hephaestus who would create Hermes' winged sandals and helmet, Aphrodite's girdle, Helios's chariot, the tools and treasures that defined divine power and enabled the gods to perform their functions. Every time the gods needed something made, something repaired, something created that required true skill rather than simple divine will, they came to Hephaestus. And in coming to him, in needing him, they acknowledged something that must have given him deep satisfaction, that they couldn't function without him. The revenge of the Golden Throne wasn't just about trapping Hera and forcing recognition, it was about fundamentally altering the power structure of Olympus. Before that throne, Hephaestus was expendable, discardable, literally throwaway. After it, he was essential. The gods might not love him, might not see him as beautiful or perfect, but they needed him, and need, in the economy of divine politics, is often more powerful than affection. His workshop on Olympus became one of the most important locations in the divine realm. The forge that had begun in the depths of the ocean, hidden away in a grotto with two compassionate sea goddesses, now burned at the heart of Olympian power. The fire that he had discovered and mastered in exile now served the gods who had rejected him. But there's a complexity here that shouldn't be overlooked. Hephaestus had won. He had forced acknowledgement, secured his place, proven his worth in the most dramatic way possible. And yet, what had he actually gained? A position among beings who fundamentally valued the very qualities he lacked. A marriage to Aphrodite, who, according to most sources, never loved him and repeatedly betrayed him with Ares. Recognition that came not from genuine respect but from necessity. The golden throne had brought him back to Olympus, but it couldn't change what Olympus was. A place where appearance mattered, where physical perfection was prized, where the kind of worth that Hephaestus embodied was acknowledged only when it became absolutely unavoidable. 2. Have you ever achieved something you thought you wanted, only to discover that the achievement itself couldn't heal the wound that drove you to seek it? For me, it has to be one of the most bittersweet realizations that external validation, no matter how hard won, can't undo the damage of early rejection. And yet, there's triumph here too. Hephaestus had fundamentally altered the terms of his existence. He was no longer defined solely by what others thought of him, but by what he could do. His forge, his craft, his creations, these became his identity, his power, his contribution to the cosmos. The gods might use him, might need him without particularly liking him, but they couldn't dismiss him, couldn't cast him out again, couldn't pretend he didn't matter. The return to Olympus marked the beginning of Hephaestus's most productive period. The armory of the gods filled with his creations, each one a masterpiece. He worked with materials both mundane and magical, with metals pulled from the earth and substances that existed only in the divine realm. His automatons, mechanical beings that could move and act independently, became famous, foreshadowing modern ideas about artificial intelligence and robotics by millennia. Every piece he created carried his mark, his particular genius for combining function with beauty, practicality with artistry. The gods might commission his work out of need, but they kept his creations out of recognition that nothing else compared. Weapons forged by other hands broke. Weapons forged by Hephaestus remained sharp through generations. Armor made by other craftsmen could be pierced. Armor made by Hephaestus turned aside even the most powerful blows. His forge became a place of constant activity, fire burning perpetually, hammer striking anvil in the rhythm that had become as natural to him as breathing. He worked alone often, preferring the company of his creations and his craft to the politics and drama of Olympic life. The Cyclopes sometimes assisted him, those one-eyed giants who understood the secret workings of metal and fire. But mostly, Hephaestus was self-sufficient, needing no one, dependent on nothing but his own skill. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all, not the forced acknowledgement or the prestigious position, but the fact that he had become someone who didn't fundamentally need what others could provide. He had his work, his craft, his forge. He had the satisfaction of creation, of problem-solving, of pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Everything else, the recognition, the marriage, the position among the Olympians, was secondary to the essential truth of who he had become. The golden throne remained on Olympus, a permanent reminder of what happened when you rejected Hephaestus. Whether Hera kept it as a trophy or a warning, or whether it was quietly removed to some storage area where uncomfortable memories are kept, the sources don't say. But its legacy persisted in every interaction between the gods and their smith. They treated him with respect now, perhaps not warmth, perhaps not genuine affection, but with the careful regard you give to someone who has proven they can't be dismissed or controlled. They commissioned his work, paid whatever price he asked, and accepted that when Hephaestus set the terms, those terms weren't negotiable. The relationship between Hephaestus and Hera remained complicated, as it would for the rest of eternity. The sources suggest they achieved a kind of uneasy detente. Not forgiveness exactly, not reconciliation in any meaningful sense, but a mutual understanding that they were bound together by blood and by the consequences of past actions. Hera needed Hephaestus's skills. Hephaestus had secured his position through forcing her to need him. It was a relationship built on necessity rather than love, on mutual wariness rather than trust. But it was a relationship that endured. And in the strange calculus of Olympic family dynamics, where patricide and revenge and casual cruelty were standard operating procedure, that counted as a kind of success. The return to Olympus completed the arc that had begun with Hephaestus's fall. Cast out as an unwanted infant, he returned as an indispensable craftsman. Rejected for his imperfection, he claimed his place through perfect skill. The journey from the heights of Olympus to the depths of the ocean and back again had transformed him from a victim of divine cruelty into a master of divine craft. And the throne, that magnificent, dangerous golden throne, stood as proof that sometimes the greatest power comes not from strength or beauty or inherited authority, but from the patient accumulation of skill, the stubborn refusal to accept rejection as final, and the understanding that if the world won't give you what you deserve, you can forge it yourself. Hephaestus had returned to Olympus, not as the broken godchild who had been thrown away, but as someone whose absence would have been unthinkable, whose presence was essential, whose work would outlast kingdoms, and whose story would echo through human consciousness for thousands of years. The fall had been the beginning. The underwater years had been the education. But the return, the triumphant, carefully calculated, absolutely devastating return, that was the moment when Hephaestus fully became himself. Not despite his rejection, but because of it. Not in spite of his pain, but through the transformation of that pain into purpose, into mastery, into the kind of power that can't be taken away because it lives in your hands and your mind rather than in others' approval. The smith of the depths had become the smith of Olympus. And in that transformation, in that hard-won return, mythology gave us one of its most profound lessons, that true worth is determined not by how you begin, but by what you build from the materials you're given, even when those materials include rejection, pain, and the long, difficult work of proving that you matter. The workshop on Olympus became the beating heart of divine power, though the gods themselves rarely acknowledged it in those terms. They preferred to think of themselves as inherently mighty, naturally superior, divinely ordained to rule. But the truth, which Hephaestus understood with perfect clarity, was that much of their power came not from who they were, but from what he made for them. 2. Without his forge, Zeus's thunderbolts would never have existed. Without his craft, Hermes would have walked rather than flown. Without his genius, the gods would have been diminished, mortal-like in their limitations, dependent on raw divine essence alone, rather than the amplified, focused, weaponized power that Hephaestus's creations provided. 2. And so the hammer fell, day after day, year after year, century after century, in the rhythm that had become synonymous with creation itself. Have you ever considered what it means to be the source of power for those who claim power as their birthright? For me, it has to be one of the most complex positions imaginable, simultaneously essential and invisible, acknowledged when needed but easily forgotten once the work is done. Hephaestus occupied that space with a kind of grim satisfaction, knowing that every weapon, every tool, every artifact that emerged from his forge bound the gods more tightly to their dependence on him. The thunderbolts of Zeus were perhaps his most famous creation, though the mythology is careful to credit the Cyclopes as well, those one-eyed giants who understood the fundamental nature of storm and lightning. But it was Hephaestus who refined the concept, who transformed raw elemental fury into something that could be wielded with precision, that struck exactly where Zeus intended and nowhere else. The king of gods might command the storm, but it was the smith of the gods who made that command meaningful, who gave it form and direction and devastating effect. I picture the forge when those thunderbolts were being made. Fire hotter than any natural flame, metals that existed only in divine realms, and Hephaestus at the center of it all, his twisted foot forgotten in the consuming focus of creation. The Cyclopes worked the bellows, maintained the temperatures, provided the raw power, but the vision, the design, the transformation of concept into reality, that was all Hephaestus. Each bolt had to be perfect, balanced, imbued with the kind of power that could shatter mountains or strike down gods. Anything less would be insufficient, would fail in the moment of greatest need. And Hephaestus never failed. The aegis, that legendary breastplate that protected Zeus and later Athena, bore his mark as well. Some sources say he created it from the skin of a divine goat, others that he forged it from metals unknown to mortals, but all agree that its power was unmatched. A defensive artifact so potent that whoever wore it became essentially invulnerable to attack. The aegis wasn't just armor, it was a statement, a declaration that the wearer stood beyond the reach of harm. When Athena wore it into battle, her enemies felt terror before she even raised her spear, because the aegis itself radiated the kind of power that made resistance seem futile. Hephaestus understood this principle intimately, that the psychological impact of a weapon or piece of armor was often as important as its physical properties. A sword that looked ordinary might kill just as effectively as one that gleamed with divine fire, but the gleaming sword inspired fear, commanded respect, shifted the balance of engagement before the first blow was struck. So he crafted beauty alongside function, created objects that were as visually magnificent as they were practically devastating. For Hermes, the messenger god, Hephaestus created the winged helmet and sandals that allowed him to fly across vast distances with impossible speed. Imagine the technical challenge alone, creating wings that would actually provide lift, that would respond to the wearer's intentions, that would function in the thin air of the upper atmosphere and the dense pressure of ocean depths with equal facility. These weren't decorative additions. They were functional marvels, pieces of engineering that turned a god into something more than he had been, that expanded his capabilities in fundamental ways. The chariots that carried gods across the sky emerged from Hephaestus's workshop as well, each one custom designed for its intended rider. Helios's chariot, which bore the sun itself across the heavens each day, had to withstand temperatures that would vaporize ordinary materials, had to maintain structural integrity under stresses that would shatter steel, had to function flawlessly day after day for eternity, because failure would mean cosmic catastrophe. The responsibility of creating such an object, knowing that any flaw, any miscalculation, any moment of careless work could result in disaster on a universal scale, would have crushed most craftsmen. Hephaestus simply built it to last. But perhaps the most famous of all his creations, the work that would be remembered and analysed and marvelled at for thousands of years, was the armour of Achilles. The story begins with loss, as so many great stories do. Patroclus, wearing Achilles' armour that Hephaestus had originally made for Achilles' father Peleus, was killed by Hector on the plains of Troy. The armour was stripped from Patroclus' body, taken as spoils of war, and Achilles found himself without protection at the very moment when his grief and rage demanded that he return to battle. Enter Thetis, the sea goddess who had raised Hephaestus in the underwater grotto, who had given him shelter and kindness when his own mother had rejected him. She came to the forge on Olympus with tears in her eyes and a request that carried the weight of old debts and deep affection. Her son needed armour, needed it urgently, and only Hephaestus could create something worthy of the greatest warrior the mortal world had ever produced. Sour. Have you ever had the opportunity to repay a kindness that changed your life? To give back to someone who gave to you when you had nothing? For me, It has to be one of the most satisfying experiences possible. That sense of completing a circle, of honouring a debt that can never truly be repaid. Hephaestus looked at Thetis and remembered the grotto, the patient teaching, the years when she had seen potential where others saw only deformity. He went to work immediately. What emerged from the forge was not just armour. It was a masterpiece, a work of art so extraordinary that Homer devoted nearly 150 lines of the Iliad to describing it. The shield alone became legendary, its surface covered with intricate imagery that captured the entire cosmos in miniature. Cities at peace and cities at war. Farmers harvesting wheat, dancers celebrating, the ocean flowing around the rim of the world. Every detail was perfect, every scene so vivid that it seemed to move, to live, to breathe. This wasn't decoration for decoration's sake. It was Hephaestus making a statement about what armor should represent. Not just protection, not just a tool for killing, but a reminder of what was being protected, what was worth fighting for. The shield showed Achilles the world in all its complexity and beauty, gave him something to contemplate in the moments between battles, offered him a vision of life that transcended the narrow focus of war. The technical achievement alone was staggering. 5 layers of metal, each one contributing different properties to the whole. Bronze for flexibility, gold for divine essence, silver for the strap that would hold it secure. The rim was triple-layered, reinforced to withstand the most powerful blows. The balance was perfect, allowing Achilles to maneuver it with ease despite its massive size and weight. And it was enchanted, imbued with protective magic that made it effectively impenetrable. Arrows that struck it shattered, spears that hit it broke. Swords that contacted its surface turned aside as if repelled by an invisible force. This was divine craftsmanship at its absolute peak functional protection, elevated to the level of miraculous intervention. But the shield was only the beginning. Hephaestus crafted a full suit of armor, breastplate, helmet, greaves, all of it working together as an integrated system of defense. The breastplate gleamed brighter than fire, its surface polished to a mirror finish that would reflect the sun and blind enemies who looked directly at it. The helmet fit perfectly to Achilles' temples, lovely and intricate, with a golden crest that rose above it to make the hero even more imposing in battle. The greaves, those shin guards that protected the lower legs, were made of pliant tin that moved with Achilles' movements, never restricting his legendary speed. Every piece was designed not just to protect, but to enhance, to make Achilles more than he had been, to transform him from the greatest mortal warrior into something that approached divine status. When Thetis brought the armor to her son, the sources tell us that it rang like thunder when it hit the ground. The Myrmidons, Achilles' soldiers, were terrified by its radiance. But Achilles took it up with joy, recognized it instantly as work that transcended anything mortal hands could create, and knew that with this armor, nothing could stand against him. The armor worked exactly as Hephaestus intended. It protected Achilles through the remainder of the Trojan War, turned aside countless attacks, allowed him to wade through enemy forces like a god walking among men. When he finally died, struck by Paris's arrow guided by Apollo, it wasn't because the armor failed, but because the arrow found the one place the armor didn't cover, the heel that had been dipped in the river Styx. Even then, the armor itself remained pristine, untouched, so valuable that it became a prize fought over by the greatest Greek heroes. But Achilles' armor, as magnificent as it was, represented only one thread in the vast tapestry of Hephaestus' creations. He forged armor for other heroes as well. Heracles received a golden breastplate and a shield described in elaborate detail by Hesiod. Memnon, the Ethiopian prince who came to Troy's aid, fought in armor that Hephaestus made at the request of Memnon's mother, Eos, the goddess of dawn. Diomedes wore a cuirass forged by the master smith, and Agamemnon carried a staff of office that proclaimed his authority through the quality of its craftsmanship. The pattern repeated endlessly. Someone needed something made, and if it needed to be exceptional, if it needed to work without fail, if it needed to carry the weight of divine power or heroic destiny, they came to Hephaestus. He created weapons as well as armor. The bow and arrows of Eros, which could make anyone fall in love, required understanding not just of metallurgy but of magic, of how to imbue an object with power that affected the heart rather than the body. The bronze clappers he made for Heracles, used to drive away the Stymphalian birds during one of the hero's labours, had to produce sound at a frequency and volume that would terrify creatures immune to ordinary noise. Even something as seemingly simple as a knife. The wedding gift he gave to Peleus and Thetis was crafted with such skill that it became an heirloom, passed down through generations. Bees. And then there were the automatons, those mechanical beings that represented perhaps Hephaestus's most extraordinary innovation. Think about what he was attempting: creating life, or at least a convincing simulacrum of life, from inanimate materials. Bronze and gold shaped into forms that could move independently, that could respond to commands, that could perform complex tasks without constant supervision. The ancient sources describe golden maidens that helped Hephaestus in his workshop, supporting his twisted frame as he moved around the forge, understanding his needs without being told. Tripods with golden wheels that could move themselves to wherever they were needed, anticipating the requirements of the gods they served. These weren't simple mechanical devices operating on gears and levers. These were magical constructs that demonstrated understanding, that showed something approaching consciousness. Hephaestus was creating artificial intelligence millennia before the concept would have a name, building beings that blurred the line between tool and servant, between object and entity. The technical challenges alone would have been overwhelming. How do you create joints that move smoothly and last forever? How do you imbue metal with the capacity to make decisions, to understand context, to adapt to changing circumstances? How do you build something that can learn, that can improve its performance over time through experience? These were questions that wouldn't even be properly formulated in the mortal world for thousands of years, and yet Hephaestus was solving them in his Olympian forge. The implications were profound, and perhaps a bit unsettling. If Hephaestus could create beings that moved and thought and acted independently, what separated them from true life? If his golden maidens could understand and assist, were they fundamentally different from mortal servants? The mythology doesn't deeply explore these philosophical questions, but they hover around the edges of every description of his automatons. The Holders Pre. What's clear is that Hephaestus viewed creation as its own reward, that the challenge of making something new, something unprecedented, something that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, that challenge was what drove him. Not glory, not recognition, not even the debt the gods owed him, but the pure satisfaction of solving impossible problems and manifesting his vision in physical form. His workshop was a place of constant experimentation and refinement. 20 bellows worked at his command, automatically adjusting their output to maintain precisely the temperatures he needed. Anvils of different sizes for different purposes, hammers of varying weights, quenching tanks with different liquids that produced different effects on heated metal. The entire space was organized with the methodical precision of someone who understood that efficiency in workflow translated directly to quality in output. And always, always the fire burned. Divine fire that never went out, that responded to Hephaestus's will as much as to fuel and air, that could be adjusted to exact temperatures with a thought. This was his element, the medium through which he expressed his genius, the force that transformed raw materials into finished marvels. Have you ever found a kind of work where time seems to disappear, where hours pass like minutes because you're so completely absorbed in what you're doing? For me, it has to be one of the defining characteristics of true calling. That sense that you're not working so much as manifesting something essential about yourself. Hephaestus lived in that state almost perpetually. The gods came to him with increasingly complex requests. Create a prison that can hold a titan. Forge a chain that cannot be broken. Design a palace that reflects the glory of Olympus. Build a trap that even divine perception cannot detect. Each challenge was accepted, considered, solved. Each creation added to his reputation, deepened the god's dependence on him, proved again that true power lay not in appearance but in ability. And through it all, Hephaestus remained fundamentally himself, focused on his work, driven by the need to create, finding satisfaction in the hammer's strike and the metal's response, rather than in the fleeting approval of those who commissioned his work. The rejection that had defined his early existence had been transformed into something like freedom, because he had learned that he didn't need the gods' love or even their genuine respect. He needed only their recognition that what he could do, no one else could match. Every thunderbolt that Zeus hurled carried Hephaestus's signature. Every time Hermes flew on his winged sandals, he travelled on Hephaestus's craftsmanship. Every warrior who wore divine armour into battle was protected by Hephaestus's genius. The influence of the forge on Olympus extended far beyond the physical objects it produced. It represented a fundamental truth about the nature of power itself. That power comes from what you can do, not who you are. That skill, carefully developed and relentlessly applied, trumps inherited advantage. That the rejected can become indispensable. That the broken can forge beauty. That the cast out can create the very weapons and tools that define divine might. The master of fire and forge had transformed personal pain into universal contribution, had turned rejection into an opportunity to prove that worth is earned through work rather than bestowed by birth. And in doing so, he had become not just a craftsman, not just a smith, but the embodiment of a principle that would resonate through human consciousness for millennia, that true mastery, achieved through dedication and skill, is its own form of divinity. The hammer continued to fall in the Olympian forge, day after day, striking the anvil in the rhythm that had become the heartbeat of divine power. And with each strike, Hephaestus was proving, again and again, endlessly and irrefutably, that sometimes the gods need mortals less than they need the one god who actually knows how to work. The marriage was a transaction, pure and simple, negotiated in the aftermath of the Golden Throne incident, when Zeus found himself trapped by his own promise and desperate enough to offer anything, absolutely anything, to secure Hera's release. And what Hephaestus demanded, what he claimed as the price for his mother's freedom, was something that seemed both perfectly logical and profoundly heartbreaking. He wanted Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, as his wife. Think about what that request revealed. Here was a god who had been rejected from birth for his physical imperfection, cast out by a mother who couldn't bear to look at him, forced to build his worth from nothing in the depths of the ocean. And now, having finally secured his place among the Olympians through undeniable skill and a display of power that left the gods no choice but to acknowledge him, he wanted the one thing that seemed furthest from his reach, the goddess who embodied everything he was not. Physical perfection, universal desire, effortless beauty that commanded worship and adoration. If the wound of his rejection centered on his appearance, on the idea that he was unworthy because his body didn't match divine standards, then marrying Aphrodite would be the ultimate proof that he had transcended those standards, that his skill, his genius, his indispensability to the divine order could compensate for any physical flaw. That he could claim as his bride the very embodiment of beauty itself, demonstrating once and for all that worth has nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with what you can achieve. It was a beautiful theory, and it was doomed from the very beginning. Zeus, trapped by his own oath and desperate to free Hera, agreed to Hephaestus' demand. The king of gods commanded Aphrodite to marry the divine smith, and because divine authority in the Olympic hierarchy was absolute, she had no choice but to comply. The sources are quite clear on this point. It was an arranged marriage, imposed from above, with Aphrodite given as a prize to someone she had never chosen and would never have chosen, given the freedom to decide for herself. Some versions of the myth add an additional layer of cruelty to the arrangement. They tell us that Zeus had declared a competition. Whoever could convince Hephaestus to return to Olympus and free Hera would receive Aphrodite's hand in marriage. Aphrodite herself reportedly hoped that Ares, the god of war with whom she was already infatuated, would succeed through force and strength. But Ares failed spectacularly, driven back from Hephaestus's forge by showers of flaming metal. It was Dionysus who succeeded, using wine and friendship and understanding rather than violence. And then Hephaestus, in a move of devastating cleverness, declared that he had brought himself back to Olympus, that he was therefore the winner of Zeus's competition, and that Aphrodite should be his. Zeus, trapped by his own words in front of the assembled gods, had no choice but to agree. Have you ever watched someone claim a victory while knowing that the winning itself would ultimately bring them no satisfaction, no real happiness, only the bitter confirmation that what they thought they wanted was never what they needed? For me, it has to be one of the saddest forms of success, achieving your goal only to discover that the achievement itself can't heal the wound that made you want it in the first place. Hephaestus married Aphrodite, and for a time, perhaps a very brief time, he might have believed that this marriage would transform his existence. He crafted for her jewelry of surpassing beauty, pieces so magnificent that they enhanced even her divine radiance. He built her a palace on Olympus, designed to showcase her glory and provide every comfort a goddess of beauty could desire. He lavished upon her all the skill and craft and attention that had made him indispensable to the gods, believing perhaps that his creations could substitute for the physical perfection he lacked. But you can't forge love in a workshop, no matter how skilled the craftsman. You can't create desire through artistry, however magnificent. And you certainly can't command affection through divine decree, regardless of who issues the order. Aphrodite had never wanted this marriage. She had been forced into it, given away as a prize, to resolve a situation that had nothing to do with her desires or preferences. And while the sources differ on the details of their relationship, one thing remains consistent across nearly every version: she did not love him. She might have respected his skill, might have appreciated the beautiful things he made for her, might even have felt some pity for this husband she had never chosen. But love, genuine affection, desire, those things were conspicuously absent from their marriage. And Ares, the god of war with his perfect physical form and martial prowess, was waiting. The affair between Aphrodite and Ares was perhaps inevitable from the moment she was forced to marry someone else. Some sources suggest they had been lovers even before the marriage, that their attraction was as fundamental as the connection between love and war, between beauty and violence, between creation and destruction. Others imply that the affair began after the wedding, as Aphrodite's form of rebellion against a union she had never wanted and would never accept. Either way, the betrayal was profound and ongoing. Imagine what it must have been like for Hephaestus, labouring in his forge to create beauty for a wife who was simultaneously betraying him with his brother, working endless hours to craft jewellery and treasures that Aphrodite might wear during her assignations with Ares, building a palace where the goddess of love entertained her actual lover while her husband sweated over the anvil, believing perhaps that the next creation, the next masterpiece, might finally earn the affection he craved. The wound of his mother's rejection, which he thought he had overcome through skill and achievement, was being reopened and deepened by his wife's infidelity. Once again, his physical appearance was the problem. Once again, his worth demonstrated through unmatched craftsmanship and indispensability to the divine realm wasn't enough. Once again, he was being rejected, but this time the rejection was ongoing, continuous, a daily reminder that he could never be what Aphrodite wanted. For a time, he didn't know, or perhaps he knew, but couldn't bring himself to confront it. The sources suggest that Hephaestus, for all his genius and perception, was blind to what was happening in his own household. Perhaps it was willful blindness, the desperate hope that if he worked harder, created more beautiful things, proved himself more valuable, Aphrodite would eventually come to care for him. Perhaps he simply couldn't imagine that a goddess would risk the consequences of adultery with the king of God's own son. But eventually, the truth became unavoidable. Helios, the all-seeing sun god whose chariot travelled across the sky each day and witnessed everything that happened below, came to Hephaestus with information that would shatter whatever illusions remained about his marriage. Aphrodite and Ares were lovers, Helios reported, and they had been meeting regularly, brazenly, taking advantage of Hephaestus's long hours at the forge to conduct their affair in the very palace he had built for his wife. The betrayal was complete. Not just infidelity, but infidelity with Ares. The embodiment of everything Hephaestus was not, physically perfect and martially powerful. The kind of god who commanded respect through presence rather than having to earn it through craft. The contrast must have been devastating. The confirmation of every insecurity that had haunted Hephaestus since his mother first looked at him with disgust. Have you ever had a fundamental fear confirmed, the thing you most dreaded proven true in the worst possible way? For me, it has to be one of the most crushing experiences imaginable, that moment when your deepest insecurity is validated, when the nightmare you've been trying to outrun finally catches you. Hephaestus was living that moment. But here's where Hephaestus demonstrated something crucial about who he had become through years of rejection and resilience. He didn't rage blindly. He didn't confront them immediately in a fury of wounded pride. Instead, he did what he had always done when faced with a problem. He went to his forge, and he built a solution. The trap he created was a masterpiece of conception and execution, as brilliant and cruel as the golden throne that had brought him back to Olympus. He forged a net of such delicate workmanship that it was nearly invisible, chains so fine they could barely be seen but so strong that even gods couldn't break them. The metal was enchanted, imbued with magic that made escape impossible regardless of divine strength or power. And then he arranged it carefully over the bed. His bed, the bed in the palace he had built, where Aphrodite and Ares conducted their affair. The sources tell us that Hephaestus announced he was leaving, travelling to Lemnos for an extended period of work. It was the opportunity Aphrodite and Ares had been waiting for. Time alone without risk of discovery, freedom to indulge their passion without the inconvenient presence of an unwanted husband. They came together eagerly, fell into bed with the thoughtless abandon of lovers who believe themselves safe from observation. And the trap closed. The invisible net descended, wrapping around them, binding them together in the most compromising possible position. They couldn't move, couldn't separate, couldn't escape. The god of war, with all his martial strength, was as helpless as any mortal caught in a hunter's snare. The goddess of love, with all her power to enchant and beguile, was reduced to struggling futilely against chains she couldn't break or charm her way out of. Hephaestus, of course, had never actually left. He returned to find them exactly as he had known he would, caught, trapped, utterly at his mercy. But instead of releasing them, instead of handling this privately as divine discretion might have suggested, Hephaestus did something that revealed the depth of his pain and anger. He called the other gods. He invited them to witness the spectacle, to see the goddess of love and the god of war bound together in adultery, to laugh at their humiliation. This was revenge on a cosmic scale, not just punishment, but public shaming, the transformation of private betrayal into communal entertainment. If Hephaestus had been humiliated by their affair, then they would be humiliated by its exposure. If he had to bear the wound of their rejection, then they would bear the consequences of being caught. The male gods came. Apollo, Hermes, Poseidon, and others, drawn by the promise of scandal and spectacle. The goddesses, with more decorum or perhaps more sympathy for Aphrodite's situation, stayed away. And there, on display for divine amusement, were Ares and Aphrodite, naked and bound and utterly unable to escape or defend themselves. The sources tell us the gods laughed. They made jokes, crude and cutting, at the expense of the trapped lovers. Apollo reportedly asked Hermes if he would be willing to endure such public humiliation for the chance to lie with Aphrodite, and Hermes answered that he would endure even worse. The scene was simultaneously comedic and cruel, a moment of divine dysfunction played out for an audience that found entertainment in others' suffering. But underneath the laughter was a darker current. Because what Hephaestus had really done was force the divine realm to acknowledge what everyone had known, but no one had said. That this marriage was a sham, that Aphrodite had never wanted him, that no amount of skill or craft or indispensability could make someone love you if they simply didn't. The exposure wasn't just about punishing Aphrodite and Ares. It was about making visible the fundamental unfairness of a system that valued physical beauty over genuine worth, that forced marriages for political convenience without regard for the feelings of those involved, that promised Hephaestus acceptance while ensuring he would never actually receive it. Poseidon eventually intervened, urging Hephaestus to release the trapped lovers and promising that Ares would pay compensation for the adultery. Hephaestus, his point made and his revenge achieved, agreed. The net was removed, and Aphrodite and Ares fled in shame. Aphrodite to Cyprus, Ares to Thrace, both desperate to escape the humiliation of their exposure. And Hephaestus demanded his dowry back from Zeus, the clear indication that the marriage was over. Whether Zeus returned it, or whether Aphrodite somehow charmed her way back into Hephaestus's tolerance, varies by source. But the essential truth was that the marriage had failed. Later sources describe Hephaestus as married to one of the Graces, Aglaia or Charis, suggesting that he had moved on, found a relationship based on something other than forced obligation and unreciprocated desire. Have you ever achieved the perfect revenge? Exposed someone who wronged you in exactly the way they deserved, and then discovered that the victory tasted like ashes because it couldn't undo the original hurt? For me, it has to be one of the most hollow triumphs possible. Proving you were wronged doesn't heal the wound of being wronged in the first place. The trap that caught Aphrodite and Ares became one of mythology's most famous stories, retold and reinterpreted for thousands of years. Some versions present it as comedy, a moment of divine farce where the clever craftsman outwits the beautiful lovers. Others see it as tragedy, the inevitable conclusion of a marriage that should never have happened, forced on people who never wanted each other and could never make it work. But perhaps the deepest truth is that it was both comic in its execution, tragic in its implications. Hephaestus had proven, once again, that his skill was unmatched, that his ability to create solutions to impossible problems exceeded anything the other gods could manage. The net that caught the lovers was as much a masterpiece as the armor of Achilles or the thunderbolts of Zeus, a demonstration of craft at the highest level. And yet, what had it really accomplished? He had exposed the affair, humiliated the guilty parties, asserted his right to justice and compensation. But he couldn't make Aphrodite love him. He couldn't change the fact that his physical appearance would always be judged by divine standards he could never meet. He couldn't undo the original wound. His mother's rejection, the fall from Olympus, the years of exile that had taught him that his worth had to be earned through achievement rather than acknowledged as inherent. The marriage to Aphrodite, which he had demanded as the price for Hera's freedom, which he had thought would prove his worth and transcend his physical limitations, had instead become another confirmation that some things can't be forged in a workshop, no matter how skilled the smith. Love, Genuine affection, desire. These things exist outside the realm of craft and creation, immune to even the most brilliant problem solving. And yet, in the aftermath of the exposure and the end of the marriage, something shifted for Hephaestus. Perhaps he finally understood that seeking validation through others, whether through his mother's acceptance or his wife's affection, was a losing game. Perhaps he realized that the satisfaction of his craft, the pride in his creations, the knowledge that he could solve any technical problem and create any object he envisioned, that these things were enough, that they had always been enough. The later marriage to Aglaia, one of the Graces, suggests a different kind of relationship, not forced, not desperate, not an attempt to prove anything, but a genuine connection based on mutual respect and compatibility. The sources give us little detail about this marriage, which perhaps is itself telling. It wasn't dramatic enough to inspire elaborate myths because it was simply functional, comfortable, a partnership rather than a prize. The story of Aphrodite's betrayal and Hephaestus's trap became a cautionary tale told across the ancient world. Artists depicted it in vase paintings and sculptures, showing the trapped lovers and the triumphant smith. Poets referenced it in works ranging from epic to comedy, using it to explore themes of justice, revenge, and the complicated dynamics of divine marriage. Philosophers debated what it revealed about the nature of love, beauty, and worth. But for Hephaestus himself, it marked the end of an illusion, the belief that his achievements could compensate for qualities he lacked, that he could earn through craft what others received through birth, that marriage to beauty itself could heal the wound of being called ugly. The trap caught more than just Aphrodite and Eris. It caught Hephaestus's own desperate hope that external validation could provide internal peace. And in releasing that hope, in accepting that some wounds don't heal and some forms of acceptance will never come, Hephaestus perhaps found a different kind of freedom. The freedom to focus entirely on his work, to create for the satisfaction of creation itself rather than to impress or please others, to be the master of fire and forge without needing also to be loved, desired or approved of by those who valued different qualities entirely. The hammer continued to fall in the divine workshop, striking the anvil in the eternal rhythm of creation. But now it fell without the desperate undertone of trying to forge the unforgeable, without the futile hope that the next masterpiece would finally make him worthy in eyes that would never see him as he wanted to be seen. Aphrodite had been his wife, and then she hadn't been, and the world continued turning. The gods still needed his creations, still depended on his skill, still came to him when they needed something made that would actually work. And Hephaestus, freed from the burden of a marriage that was never going to succeed, returned to what he had always done best, transforming raw materials into marvels, solving impossible problems, and proving that worth, real worth, comes from what you can do rather than from who loves you or how others judge your appearance. The betrayal had hurt deeply and permanently. The exposure had provided satisfaction but not healing. And in the end, the lesson was the same, one Hephaestus had been learning since the moment he fell from Olympus, that your value doesn't depend on other people's perception of you, that the work of your hands matters more than the opinions of those who judge by sight alone, and that sometimes the greatest victory is simply continuing to create, to build, to forge beauty from the materials you're given, regardless of whether anyone ever fully appreciates the cost of that creation. The stories eventually stopped focusing on his pain and began focusing on his purpose, which is perhaps the most profound transformation any narrative can undergo. Hephaestus evolved in the collective mythology from the rejected godchild, from the betrayed husband, from the outsider who had to fight for every scrap of recognition, into something far more essential. The embodiment of creation itself, the divine principle that suffering can be transformed into power, that limitation can become innovation, that the very things that break us can become the forge in which our greatest strengths are tempered. His legacy wasn't written in grand battles or epic conquests. wasn't carved from the kind of dramatic interventions that defined gods like Zeus or Athena or Ares. Instead, it was forged one piece at a time, one creation at a time, building an influence so deep and so pervasive that it became invisible, the way truly fundamental things always do. Ma. Because when you think about the great moments of Greek mythology, when you recall the heroes and their triumphs, when you remember the turning points that shaped the fate of gods and mortals alike, Hephaestus is there. Not in the foreground, not claiming glory or demanding recognition, but present in the tools that made those moments possible. Achilles striding into battle wearing armor that made him nearly invincible. That was Hephaestus. Hermes flying across vast distances to deliver messages that changed the course of wars. That was Hephaestus. Zeus hurling thunderbolts that maintained divine order and terrified titans. That was Hephaestus. Every moment of divine power, every heroic deed enabled by supernatural equipment, every artifact that transcended mortal craftsmanship carried his signature, bore his mark, demonstrated his genius. And the genius wasn't just technical, though technically he surpassed everyone. It was philosophical, representational, deeply symbolic. Because Hephaestus understood something that the other gods, with their inherited powers and effortless abilities, never quite grasped. That true creation requires transformation. That you have to take raw materials and fundamentally change their nature. That the process itself is as important as the product. A fire, his element and his tool, was the perfect metaphor for this principle. Fire destroys, yes, but it also purifies, refines, transforms. Metal passed through fire becomes stronger, more malleable, capable of taking forms it could never have achieved in its raw state. The heat that seems destructive is actually creative, breaking down to build up, eliminating impurities to reveal essential qualities. Have you ever noticed how the most valuable things are often created through processes that look, from the outside, like destruction? For me, it has to be one of the most counterintuitive truths about creation, that sometimes you have to break things down completely before you can build them into something better. Hephaestus lived this truth every single day in his forge, and he applied it not just to metal, but to his own existence. The rejection by Hera, that foundational trauma that could have destroyed him, was instead the raw material he transformed through the fire of experience and determination into resilience. The fall from Olympus that should have been his ending became his beginning. The physical deformity that marked him as unworthy in others' eyes became irrelevant once he proved that worth has nothing to do with appearance. This is what made him dangerous to the established order, more dangerous in some ways than any of the gods who wielded more obvious forms of power. Because Hephaestus demonstrated that the rules the gods took for granted, that beauty equals worth, that physical perfection indicates divine favor, that inherited power is the only power that matters, were arbitrary, changeable, ultimately meaningless when confronted with actual skill and dedication. Tucker. He created Pandora at Zeus's command, fashioning the first woman from clay and water and divine essence, giving her form and beauty and the capacity to bring both wonder and ruin to the mortal world. The mythology tells us she was punishment for Prometheus's theft of fire, a beautiful disaster designed to humble humanity. But there's something profound in the fact that Hephaestus was the one who created her. The god who understood transformation, who knew intimately what it meant to be shaped by forces beyond your control, who had experienced rejection and exile, and the long journey from worthlessness to indispensability. He was the one who gave Pandora life. Did he imbue her with some understanding of what it meant to be a creation rather than a creator, to serve purposes you didn't choose, to carry within yourself both tremendous potential and inevitable tragedy? The sources don't say, but the parallel is impossible to ignore. He forged the chains that bound Prometheus to the rock where eagles would tear at his liver daily as punishment for giving fire to humanity. Unbreakable chains, crafted with such skill that even a titan's strength couldn't escape them. There's a bitter irony here. Hephaestus, who had been saved by kindness from sea goddesses, who understood what it meant to be cast out and rescued, creating the instruments of eternal torment for someone whose crime was compassion toward mortals. But this is what being the divine craftsman meant. You made what needed to be made, regardless of how you felt about it. The chains had to hold Prometheus, so Hephaestus forged chains that would hold Prometheus. The job was the job, the craft was the craft, and personal feelings about the purpose of a creation couldn't interfere with the quality of its execution. He built palaces for the gods, structures that demonstrated not just architectural brilliance, but an understanding of symbolism and psychology. Each throne in the Great Hall of Olympus was designed specifically for its occupant, reflecting their nature, their power, their role in the divine hierarchy. Zeus's throne radiated authority. Hera's combined majesty with the trap that had once imprisoned her. A reminder, perhaps, that even queens can be vulnerable to those they've wronged. The golden automatons that served in his workshop represented perhaps his most revolutionary achievement, though the full implications wouldn't be understood for millennia. These weren't simple mechanical devices, operating on predictable gears and levers. They were artificial beings that could think, adapt, learn, respond to complex situations with something approaching genuine intelligence. Modern robotics researchers and artificial intelligence developers, thousands of years later, would grapple with the same questions Hephaestus had already solved in his divine forge. How do you create something that can make decisions autonomously? How do you imbue inanimate materials with the capacity for understanding? What's the difference between a very sophisticated tool and an actual thinking entity? The golden maidens who assisted him in his work could anticipate his needs, understand his intentions without verbal communication, support him physically and intellectually in his creative process. The tripods with wheels that moved themselves to wherever they were needed demonstrated not just mechanical motion but contextual awareness. These creations blurred the line between object and being, between tool and companion. And they raised questions that the mythology never fully addresses, but that hover around every description of Hephaestus's workshop. If you can create something that thinks and acts independently, what responsibilities do you have toward it? If your creations can suffer or feel or desire, are you their master or their parent? When does a sufficiently advanced tool become something more? Hephaestus, working alone in his volcanic forges, was pioneering ethical territory that humanity wouldn't seriously explore for thousands of years. And he did it not through philosophical debate, but through practical creation, building beings that embodied answers to questions most people hadn't yet learned to ask. His role in the myths of heroes extended far beyond simply providing equipment, though the equipment itself was transformative. When Thetis came to him requesting armor for Achilles, Hephaestus didn't just forge protective gear. He created a masterpiece that told a story, that showed Achilles the world he was fighting for, that reminded him through intricate imagery of everything that existed beyond war and glory and the narrow focus of heroic destiny. The shield alone, with its detailed scenes of cities at peace and war, of farmers harvesting and dancers celebrating, of cosmic forces and human dramas, was a work of art that transcended its function as defensive equipment. It was Hephaestus saying, through metal and magic and extraordinary craftsmanship, that there's more to existence than fighting, that beauty and creation and ordinary life have value equal to or greater than martial glory. 2. Have you ever tried to communicate something crucial through your work rather than through words? To embed meaning in the thing you're making, because sometimes demonstration is more powerful than declaration. For me, it has to be one of the most satisfying forms of expression, letting the work speak for itself, trusting that quality and care and vision will communicate what explicit statements never could. Hephaestus understood this completely. For Heracles, the hero whose labours defined what mortals could achieve through strength and determination, Hephaestus created weapons and tools that enabled feats that would otherwise have been impossible. The bronze clappers that drove away the Stymphalian birds, those metal-clawed terrors that ravaged the countryside around Lake Stymphalis, had to produce sound at precise frequencies and volumes to terrify creatures that normal noise couldn't affect. This wasn't just metalworking, it was applied acoustics, understanding how sound propagates and how different creatures respond to different wavelengths, then engineering a device that could produce exactly the effect needed. Heracles got credit for completing the labour, but without Hephaestus's innovation, the birds would have remained an unsolvable problem. The pattern repeated throughout mythology. Perseus needed tools to defeat Medusa, tools that Hephaestus crafted or influenced. Cadmus needed equipment to found Thebes. Jason's quest for the Golden Fleece involved artifacts that bore the mark of divine craftsmanship. Every major mythological undertaking, every heroic achievement, every moment when mortals transcended their limitations and accomplished the supposedly impossible, happened in part because Hephaestus had created the tools that made transcendence possible. And he did this not for glory or recognition or the kind of worship that other gods demanded. He did it because creation was its own reward, because solving problems was what he did, because transforming raw materials into objects of power and beauty gave his existence meaning in a way that nothing else could match. The forge became his temple, and work became his worship. While other gods schemed and feuded and demanded constant acknowledgement of their superiority, Hephaestus simply continued to create. The hammer fell in its eternal rhythm. The fire burned at temperatures that would vaporize ordinary materials, and objects emerged that would last forever, that would shape destinies, that would prove that the greatest power isn't the power to destroy or command or intimidate. It's the power to make things that didn't exist before. His symbols, the hammer and anvil, the tongs and bellows, the volcano's fire, became synonymous not with limitation or disability or rejection, but with transformation, innovation, and the creative force that turns suffering into strength. The twisted foot that had caused his mother to cast him out became irrelevant when compared to the works of his hands. The physical imperfection that should have defined and limited him instead disappeared into insignificance, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he could create. And perhaps this is the most profound aspect of his legacy that he demonstrated, through countless creations spread across centuries of mythology, that your worth isn't determined by the circumstances of your birth or the opinions of those who reject you. It's determined by what you choose to do with the materials you're given, by the work of your hands and the vision of your mind, by your willingness to transform pain into purpose and limitation into innovation. The gods who had once dismissed him as unworthy found themselves utterly dependent on his skills. The Olympians who valued physical perfection above all else discovered that they couldn't function without the contributions of someone they had initially rejected for physical imperfection. The divine hierarchy that seemed so absolute and unchangeable was revealed to be contingent, dependent not on inherited power alone, but on the contributions of those who actually knew how to make things work. This is revolutionary when you think about it. Hephaestus's existence and success fundamentally challenged the premise that divine society was built on, that some beings are inherently superior and others inherently lesser, that appearance indicates worth, that those born to power deserve power simply by virtue of their birth. He proved through undeniable demonstration that skill beats status, that craftsmanship trumps charisma, that the ability to create value exceeds the value of merely existing beautifully. The ancient Greeks understood this on some level, which is why Hephaestus was worshipped particularly in manufacturing centers and among craftsmen, artisans, and those who worked with their hands. He was the patron god of people who understood that worth comes from what you make, from the quality of your work, from the dedication you bring to your craft. While aristocrats might worship gods of war, or kings might honor Zeus's authority, the people who actually built civilization, the smiths and carpenters and sculptors and inventors, they understood that Hephaestus represented something more essential than raw power. He represented the principle that civilization itself is built not by the strong or the beautiful or the high-born, but by those who can take raw materials and transform them into something useful, something beautiful, something that makes life better for everyone who encounters it. The volcanic locations of his forges, Mount Etna, Lemnos, and other sites where Earth's internal fire broke through to the surface, connected him to fundamental forces of transformation. Volcanoes destroy, certainly, but they also create. The lava that buries cities also forms new land. The heat that seems purely destructive is actually part of Earth's renewal cycle. Hephaestus, working in volcanic depths, understood this duality intimately. His fire wasn't the wild, consuming fire of destruction. It was controlled fire, channeled fire, fire that served creation rather than chaos. This distinction matters enormously. It's the difference between raw elemental force and directed power, between potential and realization, between what could happen and what you make happen through skill and intention. Have you ever felt the satisfaction of taking something chaotic or broken and imposing order on it, of seeing potential in raw materials and then actualizing that potential through careful work? For me, it has to be one of the most fundamentally human experiences, and Hephaestus, despite or perhaps because of his struggles with divine society, embodied it more completely than any other god. The resilience that defined his character, the refusal to let rejection determine his fate, the determination to prove worth through achievement, the stubborn insistence that physical imperfection doesn't indicate spiritual or intellectual limitation, became itself a form of divine power. Not the flashy power of thunderbolts or the seductive power of beauty, but the deep, enduring power of someone who simply will not quit, who responds to every setback by working harder, who transforms every wound into fuel for the forge. This made him a model not just for craftsmen, but for anyone who has ever been told they're insufficient, that they don't measure up, that their limitations are insurmountable. Hephaestus' story says, maybe they're right about your limitations. Maybe you can't change the things that others use to judge you, but you can become so skilled, so valuable, so essential, that those limitations become irrelevant compared to what you can do. It's a message of empowerment that doesn't rely on denying reality or pretending that differences don't exist. Instead, it acknowledges the rejection, accepts the pain, and then asks, what are you going to build with that? How would you transform suffering into strength? What would you create from the materials of your experience, even when those materials include trauma and loss and the kind of wounds that never fully heal? The answer, in Hephaestus' case, was everything. He created everything the gods needed, everything the heroes required, everything that made divine power and mortal achievement possible. From the smallest piece of jewelry to the most powerful weapons, from practical tools to objects of transcendent beauty, from simple mechanisms to artificial beings that approached consciousness. All of it emerged from his forge, all of it carried his vision, all of it demonstrated that creation is the highest form of power. And through it all, through centuries of myths and stories, and the countless unnamed moments when gods used his creations without acknowledging their source, Hephaestus remained fundamentally himself. Focused on the work, driven by the need to create, finding satisfaction in the hammer's strike and the metal's transformation rather than in fleeting approval or recognition. The legacy he left wasn't written in words or recorded in epic poems that bore his name. It was forged in metal, cast in gold, hammered into shape one piece at a time. Every artifact that changed mythology's course, every weapon that enabled heroic deeds, every tool that made the impossible possible. That was his legacy. Present in every moment of divine power, essential to every heroic achievement, fundamental to the functioning of both Olympus and the mortal world. The god of creation and resilience, working alone in his volcanic forge, had proven something that would echo through human consciousness for thousands of years, that worth is earned through work, that suffering can be transformed into power, that limitation can become innovation, and that sometimes the gods need us more than we need them. Especially when us means those who actually know how to build things that last. The hammer continued to fall, day after day, century after century, in the rhythm that had become the heartbeat of creation itself. And with each strike, Hephaestus was forging not just objects, but meaning, demonstrating that the truest form of divinity lies not in inherited power or physical perfection, but in the work of hands that transform raw materials into marvels, that take pain and create beauty, that prove through endless creation that resilience itself is the greatest masterpiece.